So I'm going to make some introductory points. Then I'm going to talk about some specific mechanisms that you can use for truth recovery. And I'll conclude with a few comments after that. That unfortunately in societies that are dealing with conflict, we are trying to repair something that often cannot be fixed. People have died. People have lost their lives. We can't completely fix that. We can't bring people back from the dead in some miraculous way. It is a process of discovery, and we have to think about the fact that in the societies we live, it often was 30 or 40 years of conflict. And so it's going to be 30 or 40 years of engaging in issues deliberately and with purpose over a period of time. And I think when I think of Northern Ireland, South Africa, and here, that's the first thing we have to bear in mind, that this is a process. And for me, the issue of truth is a really important part of that journey to learning to live with the past. It's a key ingredient to learning to live with the past. Truth recovery and trying to find the truth about the past is not just a technical task. It's not a task for lawyers or for clever political scientists. It is both a social process and it is a political process. Truth recovery is not a mechanism. Truth recovery is a social process. And so we have to find the enabling tasks, actions that we can do to enable truth. I'm going to list 8 mechanisms that I have seen in different societies, and some have been used in this society. But again, before listing the 8, I want to make 2 points about the issue of truth and truth recovery. And the first point is, before we even embark on the journey, we have to ask the question, why do we want the truth? If we want it for the next generation and to learn from it, then our mechanisms might be different. They might be about education, they might be about museums, they might be about memorials. If our task is really that we want to uncover it so that we can prosecute people, which is a perfectly legitimate reason also to want the truth, then maybe we're going to explore judicial mechanisms before we're going to explore social mechanisms. My second starting point is to say that I do believe in societies coming out of conflict, we need to try and find the truth. We need to know why things happened. We need to learn from our mistakes in the past. But we also need to know that the truth can be positive and the truth can be negative. The truth is positive and the truth is negative at many different levels. It still doesn't mean we shouldn't seek the truth, but we should be embarking on that process, knowing that there are going to be many different ways that we're going to come out of that process. When we think about mechanisms for truth recovery, I ask 2 questions. The first question is, what is the mechanism that helps us answer the question why? And what are the mechanisms that help us answer the question what? So if we want to try answer the big why question, that's really difficult because people have very different narratives in societies about the big why question, why this conflict happened. But if we want to answer that question, we're going to have different mechanisms for answering the what. And the what is, who did what to whom? Who killed who tortured who hurt who, on what date, where and when? That's the what. Of course, the first mechanism is prosecutions, court cases, trials. The problem with the court processes is that they're slow and you have to go through them one at a time. You're not going to be able to look at 100 cases. You're going to look at 5 cases over 15 years. So although you might find a very significant truth and a truth which the society really values, it's not necessarily going to be a very big truth. It's certainly not going to answer the why did this happen. The second method, which I don't know if that's been dealt with here, but globally is an important method of truth recovery, is the opening of archives. If one can get access to archives, archives are a very good way of telling the big why story, because you have a huge amount of information that can answer quite a lot of questions. I raise this as the third option, that you can do the reopening of investigations is a potential method of truth recovery. So in Northern Ireland, they started a process which we called historical inquiries, where there were 1,800 cases from both state killing and also from armed groups that had never gone to court. And so they opened up the process for reinvestigation. Now that process, firstly, there have been 1 or 2 prosecutions that have come from that, not very many prosecutions in the Northern Ireland case. But what it also did was it allowed to create dossiers which were given to families. So the family could get a file which said, we haven't solved your case, but this is everything that we know. This is all the information that we have on your case, from newspaper articles through to official documents. So even though the case wasn't solved, they got a version of information, which is not perfect, but it's something that's different. The fourth method is a truth commission. And a truth commission is different because what a truth commission tries to do is it tries to not look at an individual case, but try to tell a story over a period of time. So at least on paper, a truth commission is better at looking at the big why than maybe a commission of inquiry, which might look at one event, or investigations, which might look at individual cases. The fifth mechanism is what you could call historical commissions or historical clarification processes. And often these processes don't rely like truth commissions on the testimony of victims. They really are an investigation. So it might be done by academics or an independent body that carries out an investigation of a certain issue. They're obviously very good at telling the big why story, but then they're not very good because they have no power to tell the individual story, to tell the what story, and to have any impact maybe on social or prosecution type processes. But that's the fifth mechanism. The sixth mechanism we could call information retrieval processes. We would call informal truth recovery processes. So these are processes which are run by community groups, by academics who might collect stories, who might meet certain victims, put it into a film. So these informal processes, I think, are really important. And if there's one thing that's common across every society I've ever looked at in truth recovery is informal processes. Victim groups, community groups, collecting stories, creating their own archives, writing books, producing DVDs and YouTube videos about what happened. And so the informal processes are really important. And then linked to that, but I will call it a separate mechanism, number 8 and the last one, is informal processes of sharing stories. So although some of these informal processes, they might build a website and you have to go on and look at it if you want to look at those stories, but you also see informal sharing processes. So I conclude with 5 quick points to maybe consider as you move forward. The first would be, how do we create a conducive environment, an enabling environment that allows truth recovery to happen? And that's really difficult. It's going to be different in every context. Number 2, we need to approach this knowing that whatever we do might be necessary, but it might not be sufficient. But we need to know that this is a long journey and that there are going to be multiple mechanisms on the process. And so if you're embarking on truth recovery here, chances are there's going to be multiple approaches at different moments in time. So the third lesson or issue to maybe discuss today for me would be, do we need to also consider sequencing? And what I mean by that is what is best to come first and second. So in different societies that might look different. And if you think of South Africa actually was a sequenced process. So although there was this idea that if you told the truth you could get amnesty, there were only a period of 2 or 3 years where that law stood. So if you didn't apply in that time, you could be prosecuted afterwards. So it was sort of giving people an opportunity, but if you didn't, you could be prosecuted afterwards. Now, the state has never prosecuted people, but in theory, it was a sequence process. So sequencing, I think, is important. The fourth point to end off is you have to think about the coherence between different processes. How do they relate to each other? So if you say to a victim, well, and it links to sequencing, he has reparation, he has compensation, but you don't deliver any form of justice. Of course they're going to respond and they're going to say to you, that's blood money. That's money to keep me quiet. That's not money to do justice. So how a reparation or compensation process links to a truth recovery process, links to justice, links to storytelling. You have to think about the relationship between them. And so for me, that would be a question. What is the relationship between the different mechanisms you might look at? And the fifth and the final one, and then I promise to stop, is that we also need to recognize that sometimes it's the process and not just the object that makes truth recovery valuable. And what I mean by that is how we engage people, how we come to the idea in South Africa that we want amnesty for justice, how we engage the community to get to the mechanisms that we ultimately choose is sometimes as important as what they deliver. And as a social psychologist, we know this very well, that sometimes people are willing to accept things, even if they're quite unjust, if they feel that there is a proper process that has been established. And so sometimes we can look at the outcome. We want this truth commission. We want this type of a process without thinking about what are the steps to get there. And how we engage people to get there can sometimes be as important as what it is that we deliver.